Welcome to Interplay, Conversations in Music. This is Michael Shapiro, your host, with special guests, violinist Gil Shaham in Boston, Scott Wheeler also in Boston, Michael Shapiro in Chappaqua, as always. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Great to see you. I've been so touched by the wonderful, burgeoning friendship, musical and personal, between Gil Shaham and Scott Wheeler. I first learned about your relationship, which is fabulously fruitful and wonderful, when I met Scott a few years back in a chamber series we did here in Chappaqua. And then we got to know each other very well through song and then talking about the Singing Turk, which I will get to shortly.
Yes.
But I'm very curious, you know, Gil, you have played everything with everyone in every place, from the Berlin Philharmonic on down. You're even in the Boston Symphony virtual world right now, where you are in the middle of a burgeoning, I'm using burgeoning a lot, snowstorm.
That's right. I'm usually in New York, but you're catching me in a hotel room in Boston. I'm here to join the BSO for their virtual series.
And you were just in Philadelphia doing the same thing with Yannick, I think, right?
Yes, that's correct. Actually, Yannick wasn't there this time. I was very lucky to be with David Robertson.
Oh, very nice.
Who is a wonderful conductor and also brother-in-law. So it was very special.
That's right.
Special experience.
That's right. I heard him conduct Porgy last year in a different era.
So did I. Yes, I saw that production. I loved that.
Absolutely. But, you know, composer Scott Wheeler, we sit alone, we write our pieces. You're not a violinist, but you certainly write like you know the violin. So tell me the story first of your second violin sonata, which follows, by many years, I think, your first violin sonata.
My first violin sonata is the earliest piece of chamber music that I acknowledge, that I say, this is not exactly a student piece. And it's from 1985. And it was written for Sharon Leventhal, who is a Boston-based violinist, still teaches at Boston Conservatory. And I was so scared of writing for the violin. It's just such a wildly different thing to do, so that I took every note to her and checked everything out. And she was sort of my violin whisperer. And she actually then commissioned my first violin concerto and the Singing Turk. And so I've worked with her a lot on this, and that's where I get my sense of that instrument, how the left hand works, how the right hand works, everything about it. I was really thinking about hard that way. And guess who the pianist was when, for the first sonata in 1985, a guy named Tony Tomasini.
You write for the Times, right?
He played the premiere. So I rehearsed with Tony and Sharon, right, and we put it on a few times. They did a great job on it.
And more recently, you wrote the Singing Turk, which Gil has taken up. Now, Gil, this composer gets in touch with you, right? And he says, I've got this piece. So how did you two meet? And then why did you have that chemical reaction? Because you had to have been, as we used to say in the jazz world, sent in order to play this piece. Don't you think?
Well, as I heard you guys speaking, I guess I was a couple of thoughts. One is, Michael, you also write very fluently for the violin. And do you play violin?
No, I don't.
No.
No.
But do you consult with violinists, or how do you?
Well, surely I do. But you know what, the most thing, I don't play tuba either. But I listen to everything all the time, and have for my entire life. Right. My first violinist was my Uncle Charlie, who studied violin. He was a dentist, but he studied violin in the 1920s when he was suffering from polio. So he'd come over to the house and bring a violin book, and we'd sit and we'd read through all the concerti. So before I conducted the Mendelssohn Concerto many years later, I'd already memorized it because I played the piano part. So that's how I started, hearing my Uncle Charlie. So Gil, what is in the writing of Scott Wheeler that is so immensely pleasurable?
Yes, well,
really what we're talking about for the
well,
violin.
Scott always asks, he says, look, maybe the violin part might not be, it's awkward. It's always flawless. There's never any question, and I don't think there's ever, there were a couple of places where Scott said, look, Gil, you should feel free to improvise or swing in the rag or something. So, maybe we made some changes that way, or maybe I read some wrong accidentals or something, but the violin writing is always flawless. And he does ask, but I feel like he asks and knows the answer in advance. And then now how did it happen with the Singing Turk? Did we meet before?
We talked about the piece in progress as I was working on it, and I sent it to you. I did send it to you. It was actually Edgar Vincent who introduced us, Gil.
That's right.
Edgar Vincent was Gil's PR person, but he was really a kind of a guru to many of us. I went to Edgar for all kinds of advice, and miss him very much. He must have died about 10 years ago.
Something like that. Very old world impresario, man of music.
Yeah, he had been back from the 50s and Beverly Sills, managing people like that from long ago. And he took up Placido, and he had you. I was at his memorial service, and I met Baryshnikov. He had worked for Baryshnikov. Anyway, so by lucking out and hanging out with Edgar, I got in touch with you, and I sent you a concerto, and we got talking, and we continued to correspond. And suddenly you're doing this sonata of mine all over the world, my friend. So then you skipped ahead when you talk about the rag, but then I did write the rag just for you.
And you wrote it.
That's true. That was sort of this year. But I don't know if, Scott, if you know that when we first got the music for Singing Turk, I had a rehearsal with my good friend and wonderful pianist, Akira Eguchi. And we played through it, and we loved it. And we were like, we have to start programming the piece, And you were asking, Michael, before, Scott just has a sense for violin, for the sound of the violin, for the colors. When I think of that sonata, it goes through so many different voices of the violin, low register, high register, many notes, single notes, a whole range of violin expression. And Scott just has a feel for the violin that I love, that, lets us sing. It's not a very precise, my English isn't describing this very precisely.
Okay, in Ivrit.
But בעברית, he makes the violin sing. הוא נותן לכינור לשיר.
תודה. So, let's talk. Wheeler, did you get that? Sorry.
I think I got what I need about that. I'm embarrassed and flattered.
You got what you needed.
There is the aspect too of the singing that's in the title, and that relates to the opera excerpts that are embedded in that sonata. And I think of the fact that Gil has an entire CD of opera paraphrases, so that he is also an opera singer through the violin. And I think there's some kind of connection going on there.
Let's talk, if we might, about the inner workings of the Singing Turk, Scott Wheeler's second violin and piano sonata, as played by Gil Shaham so brilliantly. There are elements of Scott Wheeler. There are elements of pastiche, of opera, all in this kind of mixed salad. So Gil, first, what's going on in this piece? And how were you attracted to it as a performer of opera pieces?
Well, I think that Scott is much better equipped at discussing the breakdown of the piece. But what's incredible for me is the versatility of the writing. You know, the first movement, and please jump in if I'm saying the wrong thing, is loosely based on Handel. Is that fair?
Of course.
Is it right? The aria is
Yes.
from the aria is from Handel. Although the opening, I don't know, how would you describe it? It's
a wildly abstracted bit of that aria, which only slowly assembles itself.
That's an interesting way of putting it.
That's what happens. Throughout the first half of the piece, we find out, oh, this Handel was actually going on there. That's what this was about. And then it departs and briefly returns at the end. That's the shape of the first piece, of the first movement. You know, as far as Michael's question, what's Wheeler and what's, say, Handel? I used to be so concerned when I started writing, how could I write something that's my music? And I find more and more that the more I look at somebody else's music, like Handel, the more it becomes me. Mm-hmm. The more I'm open to allowing the Handel in, the more my own actual voice seems to emerge. I don't know what that's about. I guess I'm just older and I don't care.
I want to add to that a French philosopher once said, and I don't remember his last name, that we forget things so that we can remember them. But in this case, it does come through. Now, Gil, it's very interesting because I've been listening to many of your recent videotapes that you've done throughout the world. You're very much drawn, I think, to the structure and sound of Baroque music. Am I right?
You know, the older I get, the more I am. It's true. You're absolutely right. I don't know that I've ever said it out loud the way you just did, but I think that's probably true. I think the violin is a Baroque instrument, you know, and I love that era and that feeling of experimentation, you know. This was the time when violins were not quite formed, you know. The tuning wasn't uniform, the size wasn't, many things weren't uniform. And then they came upon this violin and everything was experimental, everything was new. And and so I feel as a violinist somehow particularly drawn to that. There's something about Baroque bowings that are very comfortable, you know. Later, even in the classical era, or certainly by the time you get to the 19th century, composers write very long notes for instruments, and I do love that. You know, that gives us a chance to sing in a certain way, but it's not quite as natural as those short Baroque things on the violin. I don't. It's very hard to say, but it's true. I am always drawn, and the Baroque composers experimented with violin duets and violin trios and violin as accompaniments and violins as solo instruments, and I do love that.
The progress from the viola da gamba, suddenly the violins coming in, the cellos coming in, and the other instruments are following. I spoke to a cellist recently, and she said that Bach wrote cello pieces, not necessarily for the gamba, you know. He said it was the new instrument in a way. Now, I
think of those Tanzmeisters. You know, those Tanzmeisters, they had their pochettes, the little violins in their pockets, and they would go and teach, you know, they would teach the dances. And the violin was the vehicle by which they would teach the dances. They would arrive, and then they would take out their violin from their pocket, and play a gavotte or a bourrée or whatever it would be.
I think you see this.
I know I've heard you often play Bach as an encore, but you introduced me just recently to a Baroque composer, late Baroque, Leclerc.
Yeah. What do you think, Scott?
I find it's very inspiring. Those Leclerc duets, and that's not a Baroque composer that I even knew. I don't know how much. I mean, of course, he's a well-known composer, just as a name to me, though. But I've been exploring them with great interest, with purpose, of course, because I'm writing a duet for Gil and his wife Adele Anthony. And I'm using the Leclerc in some sense as an oral model.
Although there is an incredible story about Jean-Marie Leclerc. I don't know if
Tell us.
I don't want to take too much time, and I'm probably going to get this wrong. You know, I'm probably not going to say the correct story.
Short version.
But what I remember is that Jean-Marie Leclerc was a virtuoso violinist living in Paris, and he ended up marrying a lady of the aristocracy who was very much involved in musical engraving at the time, you know, and Jean-Marie Leclerc was found murdered outside their estate, I think there was a police case that was open, where they couldn't. They never found out who the murderer was or something, but it appeared to have been caused by a blunt trauma to the head, perhaps from an instrument used for musical engraving.
Oh my.
and of course, Madame Leclerc was never charged or investigated, as she was a member of the aristocracy.
God, I would recommend that we pay our copyists, okay?
Yeah.
You know, I never knew this story, Gil. This is fabulous. We add this to this story of Gesualdo, you know, stabbing his wife and her boyfriend in the bed, and also the story of the French composer on the bicycle who crashed. We won't have to go into all of this, but this is crazy stuff.
What was this? Haydn and the Haydn's skull? Somebody just told me. What is this story?
It was a Shakespeare skull. I can't keep them straight. One of them was stolen. I know that.
I think his skull was stolen from his grave or something. Yeah.
Crazy stuff. All right, we're going to get off the macabre and go back to the Singing Turk, because the feature of our discussion today is played by Gil Shaham, our guest, and written by Scott Wheeler, our guest. Scott, the second movement of the Singing Turk. Talk about it just briefly. It's so different, isn't it?
The composer is Gilbert. The composer whose source is embedded there is Gilbert. And you know, he's not known as a composer. And in fact, what he gave us is something like a lead sheet. It really isn't a proper aria, but it was an opera about a woman in a Turkish harem, and a European woman, a French woman. And the star of the opera was Madame Favart. And Favart was the librettist, and his wife was the star, and she sang and she accompanied herself on the harp.
Wow.
Famously. So that was what it was. So it's this famous harp aria for her. And we just have the melody. So I just took the melody and I gave it my own chords.
Beautiful.
So da 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 da. That's what you're doing, Gil, is taking her aria, which says, you may be the man in charge here, but I own your heart. Mm-hmm. You cannot escape because you're in love with me. So that's the meaning of that aria. So the slow movement is all about.
It's lovely, and it has the Baroque flavor, but it has the Wheeler touch. Now, Gil, I'm very interested about the third movement, which takes off. So talk about that, would you?
Well, I think really we cover so many styles and so fluently. I think, you know, maybe, I don't know if you would say the second movement, that's some sort of impressionist or something like that. The third movement is Rossini and joyous, you know, and they really work beautifully as a sonata that way, you know. And yeah, you know, this is more virtuosic violin. I mean, you do get to sing, but I feel like maybe the violinist in the Rossini orchestra playing their 16th notes, something like that.
Well, it's also coloratura. You see, the singers, you got it. They do actually those arpeggios. The singers do them, and what happens is that you and the piano duet in a way that hasn't been true in the other movements, so that it becomes not just an aria, but a duet in the last movement, so that the joyousness comes in part from the trade-offs.
Well, it comes through. It's very effective, and the difference between the three movements is striking, but it all hangs together because it's in your voice, as played by Gil Shaham. Now,
and Akira, he does such a wonderful
Eguchi.
job.
I'm sorry, say again?
The pianist Akira Eguchi, he's so wonderful.
Thank you for mentioning.
Longtime friend, and he really plays it so beautifully.
He does. He does. So we're living through this period of isolation, as it were, and with three people in three different places, although you're both in Boston for a while. You wrote a rag. You call it Isolation Rag. You wrote it for Gil Shaham, our guest. So Scott Wheeler, talk about Isolation Rag. And then, Gil, I'm very curious to hear how you reacted to it during this period.
Well, I just woke up one day hearing this melody and saying, that's what this is. This is a little ragtime piece that's a little bit sad, and it's in major, but it's a little bit haunted or wistful. And you see, the last concert I went to, live concert, was in March, and it was Gil and Akira in Los Alamos, and their encore was the Graceful Ghost Rag of William Bolcom. And I love the feeling that he gave. And although that's a minor key one, I thought of something a little bit like that to give to Gil as a solo. And then in the midst of it, what sort of emerges are little bits of the concertos that Gil plays all the time with orchestras that he can't play.
You can hear that in there. So what was your reaction when you got it?
Well, Scott sent it in an email, and very sort of quiet, unassuming, hey, have a look at this, something like that. And I was very honored, and I opened it up and I started playing it, and I love it. And it's subtle, it really captures the feeling of our time perfectly. There's something about Scott's subconscious that really honed in on something. On the top of the page, I think you write the word cheerfully.
Yeah, right? I find it very funny. In a piece that's totally bittersweet. But thank you, Scott, for combining different things all at once, because that's what we do.
But that is what I was doing. I was in my room cheerfully reading through this, and underneath it there is an undertone of, well, when can I see my friends? When can I, join an orchestra? When will I play Brahms Violin Concerto, Mendelssohn Violin Concerto? And somehow that the piece captures that blend perfectly.
It does. I want to talk just to end our conversation just very briefly. Scott's mentor in many ways was Virgil Thompson, who I only met briefly and had a wonderful conversation on the phone with him about Preciosia, his piece for a vocal piece, which he told me the derivation of in only a way Virgil could. But in Virgil's, one of his books, he talks about a kind of circle in the middle, who is the composer, surrounded by the instrumentalists, surrounded by the orchestra, surrounded by I think he puts agents way up here. Or Solyarek is nowhere there, or Arthur Judson. Don't want to know from them. But the point of the matter is, he felt, as a composer, of course, that we create the ripples that go out to people like you, Gil. So it's obvious that there's a ripple that has been sent from Scott Wheeler to you, which has been very meaningful. And I think it has enriched your life. Talk about that a little, please. And then I'd like to hear what Scott feels about going the opposite direction. Very quickly.
Well, I do love that. And I feel like, I guess I always say that is our job. We're like actors, we're instrumentalists, that is. We are people who read something on the page, and then we try to bring it to life for our audience. And I do love this image, this analogy of the pebble drops, and then the waves start resonating, and it really is a
Circles.
ritual.
I think there's even a drawing in the book about it. Scott, speak to this.
Well,
Now you're going from the opposite direction that Gil is.
Well, yeah, but that is the direct connection, because you see, when I'm writing for Gil, as I am now in this duet, and as I am in a concerto, the concerto is going to be called Birds of America.
Wait, I can't wait.
The thing is, people always ask me as a composer, who you're writing for? Do you write for yourself or do you write for the audience? And I always say, I write for the performer, because only the performer is going to reach the audience. If I don't reach the performer, then there's no way it's going to get through to the audience. It has to be through that. So I'm listening to Gil, but of course, Gil, I've been watching him. And if you've ever watched Gil Shaham perform, okay, the vivid changes of expression and the way that he coordinates and relates to his pianist or his orchestra or his conductor or other soloists, it's amazing. He's so present that there's this electricity. So I'm trying to tap into some of that.
Or you certainly have. And there's a joy coming from both of you, which is obvious in this only half-hour conversation that we can have today. But I want to thank my guests, Gil Shaham and Scott Wheeler, for joining me. Thank you.
It's a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael.
And I'm Michael Shapiro on Interplay, Conversations in Music. Thank you for joining us.